Webinar. Okay, welcome back, everyone. This is part 3 of our Zero Trust 101 webinar series, today focusing on segmentation. And when we think about micro-segmentation, which really is an industry in and of itself, we're thinking about those mid to large enterprises with a big on-premise environment. And as we delved into last week, looking at visualization, there's been a dramatic rise of east-west traffic inside the network. This has meant an inability of perimeter firewalls to provide true visibility into the internal network, and it's made it a challenge to block hackers and users on the inside. Traditionally, solutions like VLANs and firewalls, they're very complex and costly to deploy inside the network, and they don't deliver that granular segmentation we're looking for, and therefore are ineffective against lateral movement and breaches. So hopefully today, and I'm joined again by my colleague Alan Fennick at Color Tokens, who are our Zero Trust partner. We're going to show you effectively a solution that provides you with that full visibility into internal traffic, the vulnerabilities, how to protect work assets like servers, applications and workloads, and application level segmentation based on the zero trust posture that we've covered in previous sessions. So at this point, I'll hand you over to Alan, who'll go through segmentation. All yours, Alan.
Thanks, Nick, and welcome everyone to the third part of this series. Thanks for your attendance. Firstly, I just wanted to recap on some of the things that we discussed last week around zero trust and what the key principles are. So we want to be able to review and approve what the acceptable interactions are and understand what the known good connectivity is within our network. So last week we talked about visualization. That's a key portion of how we start to go about building a micro-segmentation solution. We also want to be able to make sure that the policies that we create are dynamic and they have the best granularity that they possibly can. So to do this, we want to be able to deploy, we want to be able to observe and enforce policies as close to that particular workload as possible. And this is part of the key principle of why micro-segmentation is key as part of building your zero trust initiative. Equally, we need to be able to continuously monitor this and improve any changes that we make. Dynamic environments demand policies to be flexible and be able to move with workloads as they transition from one particular location to another. So as we can see here, we want to aim to be in this zone, effectively moving up the stack. We've all experienced deploying perimeter firewalls or next generation internal firewalls, but they don't necessarily give you that granularity that you need to ensure zero trust as a full solution. So we need to look at things like deploying potentially device agents or using APIs potentially to control points around the workload. Or we can go in further up to start to look at enforcing policy using something like a kernel agent. So how does micro-segmentation work? Well, really what most businesses are doing when they're looking at segmentation is to try and understand what the most critical assets are inside your organization, the so-called crown jewels. So we don't want anyone internally that doesn't need to access those crown jewel applications to give them access. We want to be able to restrict that and create what we call a trust zone. So there have been many circumstances where people have used traditional architectures such as VLANs, such as ACLs, or they've put a degree of software-defined firewalls in between portions of their environments. That actually doesn't go down to the level that you might need to be able to achieve pure micro-segmentation. So we want to be able to effectively put a ring fence around those crown jewels. So that's the key principle of micro-segmentation. And drilling into it a little bit further, let's examine the common use cases. So you may have environments that are development, test, and production, and they may be able to freely talk to each other. However, data really shouldn't be necessarily transferred between development, test, and production. There may be personal data, there may be things that shouldn't be exposed between those environments. So microsegmentation is a good way of auditing and understanding how we lock down those controls. And as I mentioned earlier, most businesses don't start by saying, we're going to go out there and microsegment everything inside our network. They will typically start with a section of those applications and put a ring fence around them, a ring of steel, to try and prevent any either external or internal connectivity from taking place, or potentially malware spreading into those particular applications through malicious activity that has taken place inside your network. The other portion of this is, if you are moving into a cloud transformation project, or you're looking at some form of bimodal deployment, you may want the ability to be able to say, okay, I understand what my security posture is right now on my on-premise solution, but I need to move that into a cloud. So microsegmentation gives you the opportunity to say, okay, we fully understand what we need to do to secure this application once it has transferred over to the cloud. And the final point is, microsegmentation now doesn't just necessarily sit within the data center or sit within your cloud environments. It actually is now moving more towards the endpoint and user. This is all key and portion or parts of how we start to build up a good posture around segmentation. So why haven't people adopted microsegmentation? What's been difficult about it? Well, with traditional setups, it's very difficult without having that visibility that we mentioned in the last session to go about creating your microsegmentation setup. And that's because effectively you don't have a map. You have probably lines and lines and lines of ACLs or firewall rules that you need to understand before you can start to go about making rule sets. Equally, multi-environments are part of this issue, why people haven't adopted it quickly, because multi-environments means that you have potentially DR sites, you have applications living in very, very different diverse portions of your infrastructure. So what this means is that typically security has been tied to the network. And what I mean by tied to the network is it's effectively been a function of a firewall, a function of a switch. Really, security should be separate from that particular network effort, right? So what we're trying to do with microsegmentation is split the relationship between the network and security, segregate the two things, because it basically means that if you're on a network and you want to create ACLs or firewall rules, even small changes can require large efforts. And we want to make sure that when we do deploy microsegmentation, that we do no harm. So we need the ability to be able to effectively test before we roll out any policy. And we'll talk about that a bit later, how we approach that problem. And equally, applications are now everywhere. As I mentioned earlier, we have people working from home. We have a lot more diverse infrastructure that really that policy should be applied to across the board. So let's have a look at the difference between doing something with your traditional firewall-based segmentation versus what you might do with a policy-based workload segmentation. An example here shows you that actually it might need 143 firewall rules just to place a ring fence around a particular application, for instance. Whereas if you move towards a more policy-based workload segmentation, the amount of changes is extremely minimal. 143 versus 6, and this is based on a customer example where we did a study. We looked at how many changes they had to make previously in their traditional infrastructure, which had much less granularity, versus what we would do if we were to deploy a microsegmentation solution based on host firewalls. So let's have a look at what microsegmentation really needs to get started. So as we've mentioned before, visibility is key. You have to have a real-time map to show you, because you can't segment something you can't see. And we need to show all of that traffic flow and data between applications and how they're talking to each other in real time. And equally, it needs to adapt to any infrastructure changes. You don't want to be in a position where you have to rewrite policy or rewrite rule sets just because something has shifted. And secondly, from a policy element, that decoupling that I mentioned is taking away the onus on the network, which really is there to just provide connectivity and switch packets. and decouple that from your security effectively. We also want to be able to label things in some form of natural language, because IP addresses are good, but naturally, once you start to look at IP addresses at scale, that can be a very complex thing to manage, especially from an audit perspective. And then the third thing is we want to be able to enforce those policies. So we've taken an approach at Color Tokens where we actually utilize the stateful native firewall of your operating system. So this, if it were Windows, would be Windows filtering platform. If it were Linux, it would be IP tables. And we also support other operating system types as well, such as Mac OS, AIX, for instance. And we want to be able to simulate that policy before we get into the position where we apply it. And we want to avoid any tampering, and we also want to be able to have a kill switch. So if someone does have something malicious happen on their environment, we have the ability to shut that down very quickly and stop any bad activity from continuing. So let's briefly just touch on the Color Tokens platform again and how this is deployed. So we have an agent that can be deployed into any environment and practically any operating system. This talks back to our Color Master instance, and we can then start to go about visualizing and creating policies alongside with the rule engine. So what I'd like to do now is just pause here, and I'll open up our session here and give you a brief demonstration of how this is put together from a micro-segmentation perspective. Okay, thanks. So from here, as we mentioned earlier, once we deploy the agent, we have several assets, and we really need to understand that the tagging format of this is critical. So we're applying metadata to each one of the assets. So this, for instance, has an application of SharePoint. Its environment is production, and its location is in Houston, for instance. It also has a role of a web server, but it could be an app server, it could be a DB, but we apply these tags logically to each one of those assets so that we can start to go about creating groups. And from groups, we have 4 sections here. We have workload, endpoint, network, and domain. If we look at the workload tab here, we can start to create customizable tags to identify what environment that belongs to. So is it, for instance, an ERP system? Is it a Flutter system? Is it PCI? Is it HR? Once we've done that, we can start to go about creating policy using these logical groups. If we look at endpoint here, we can start to categorize what people's teams are. Is it accounting? Is it HR? Is it IT? And again, we can create customizable policies for each one of these groups. Equally, if you want to do this via essentially CIDR rules or subnets, we can jump into these and create custom subnet tags where we can apply network addresses effectively, or block spaces, to make rule sets based on those particular subnets. And equally, if you have domains externally that you want to provide access to, we have Amazon here, for instance, you can use a wildcard to specify that fully qualified name, and again, create rule sets on the back end of that. What I'd also like to show you here is the status of these rule sets that we're going to create. So as I mentioned earlier, we have a mode called observed. This is where we are just effectively observing traffic. We're not doing any enforcement at this point in time. But equally, we can go into an enforced mode and restrict inbound and outbound access to those assets once we're comfortable that we've captured all of the information that we need. In most examples, an application may not behave the same every day. There may be monthly cyclical activities where a billing run is performed that we need to capture that traffic. So we observe it first, make sure that we're comfortable we've captured all of those flows, and then we go into potentially an enforce mode. But as I mentioned earlier, most organizations will start by looking at their most critical applications first before they go about making changes and enforcing policies over all their estate. So this maps back to what I was showing you on the visualizer last week. We can start to drill in and understand what policies are being applied across the board to each one of these applications that we've added effectively policy to. So in this example, we have already added some policy. We can see that this PCI environment can talk out to the internet on an SSL session. That's allowed traffic represented in the green. Equally, if we have block traffic, that's represented in the red lines here. We can see that we're denying this RDP session from one network to another. And we can drill in and out of these objects in real time and understand what the policies are. We can equally show alerts. So if you are in listen mode and you only want to understand what is breaching policy, we can show you this visually. And we can see here, for instance, that we have an inbound scan alert from an unknown host, which is trying to do a port scan on one of your assets. So very, very useful in that listen mode to understand what events are happening on your network. And with that, I'd like to hand back to Nick, who's going to summarize our session and potentially take some questions as well. So over to you, Nick. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. And yeah, I forgot to mention at the start, if anyone's got any questions, please use the Q&A tab on the left. And a couple have already come through that I'll put to you, Alan. Obviously, there's a strong relationship between the visualization piece we did last week and the segmentation piece as well. But can I buy licenses just for visibility? That piece alone, I think, would be powerful enough to get started.
So this is around, what does the licensing model look like? So the answer is yes. If you just want to have visibility and you don't want to take the leap into doing enforcement, we can provide a license just for that purpose. Equally, we can mix and match. Say, for instance, you wanted visibility on 200 assets, but you only wanted to enforce on 20. We can offer, a split license for that purpose. Hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah. And the next question that came through is how quickly can I get value deploying color tokens with the infrastructure you just showed? Will it take a lot of internal resources, infrastructure, and money to do that?
Okay, well, the first point, I guess, is that we're cloud delivered. So there's no onus on anyone to actually stand up their own infrastructure to quickly deploy color tokens. So other than, compared to other solutions where you have to have some form of on-prem or cloud-based solution that you host yourself, we actually take care of all of that on the back end. So it's very little resource constraints needed around that. So yeah, we typically see value from it within days. And it's not too onerous on the client to provide too many resources for that.
Okay, thanks, Alan. I don't think there's any more questions, but just to recap, we presented here a solution to help visualize and define micro-segment boundaries or micro-perimeters. These are for work assets, cloud workloads, and we do that using tags and attributes that are easy to define. And then we can apply policies to those based on the least privilege concept that obviously is part of the zero trust model. Thanks again for Alan for presenting, and thanks to all of you for attending. Do attend next week where we'll be talking about lockdown and endpoint protection. Until then, have a great weekend.